Pastor Ed here with Daily Devotions for Thursday, June the 20th, 2024. This week we've been talking about, other than Tuesday when we talked a little bit about Father's Day, but yesterday, now again today, and in the next couple of days as well, talking about the whole issue of slavery, particularly in the Old Testament, a little bit on Saturday in the New Testament. That was in response to the Did You Ever Have a Question sermon that I did this past Sunday. Why was slavery okay if God treated everybody with respect? And I don't know who wrote the question. I don't know exactly what was behind that. All I have was the words there, and it seemed to imply, at least to me, that is slavery something that God created, or at least that God allowed? And what I tried to say in my sermon is that slavery is something that we've done ourselves. It was not commanded or endorsed by God. In fact, as we started to see yesterday, in the Old Testament, the law tried to regulate. It was already a reality. It was widespread in the ancient world. It was a part of life at that time, and really up until until modern times, there are still people in some form of slavery or bondage or human trafficking or whatever, that are still in effect slaves today. And yesterday, I forgot to mention it yesterday, but yesterday, of course, was Juneteenth. And we're reminded that it's only been, a century, not quite, about a century and a half since there were legally slaves in this country. So I started to share an article written by a rabbi by the name of Benjamin Skolnick, and he talked about Exodus, how Deuteronomy kind of softened that. Leviticus had a different take. Leviticus seemed to be the most humane, and I want to continue his discussion today, where he says Deuteronomy, it would seem, if you remember yesterday's daily devotion, more humane than Exodus, but less humane than Leviticus. Deuteronomy, for instance, states that the owner should give provisions to the freed servant, whereas Exodus does not have anything at all about this. In Deuteronomy, however, there is such a thing as the permanent bondage of an Israelite. Deuteronomy does not seem to have the same anti-slavery ideal as Leviticus does. And as he points out, this is not the moral trajectory that we would prefer. We'd rather have Deuteronomy, the later text, as the more abolitionist text. But he points out that Sarah Jaffet, a biblical scholar, shares that concern. In an article she once wrote, she noted that Deuteronomy seems to be a step backwards from Leviticus. And she wonders what might have prompted Deuteronomy, with its emphasized humane tendencies, to retain, again, permanent bondage. And she explains that Deuteronomy is more realistic about life and society, that takes into account the demands and realities of real life. Another scholar by the name of Jeffrey Tigay makes a crucial point that while Exodus and Deuteronomy require the release of slaves after 6 years of service, Leviticus only required the release of slaves in the Jubilee or 50th year. Why would Leviticus not have the system of 7-year cycles? Excuse me. He goes on to say that Leviticus seems to care less about the individual than the family. At the end of 50 years, the family would go free. The descendants of the individual would benefit, would regain their property. Leviticus is concerned for the clan's land, that it should be returned to the clan, and that's why a kinsman of the man in debt is allowed to buy the land actually even earlier than the Jubilee. Well, in these lessons, Rabbi Skolnick points out, we see this move from a tribal to a national consciousness. The Book of the Covenant in Exodus 21 to 23 reflects what he terms a tribal society. Leviticus is still concerned primarily about the family. By the time of Deuteronomy, though, the nation state has replaced the family, the clan, the tribe as the key entity. So to briefly review the outline of Israelite history, he points out that David and his son Solomon changed the tribal inheritances into federal districts, and those northern tribes actually split into a second kingdom. Afterwards, many of those northern tribes were then transplanted to Assyria. What was left then was really the kingdom only of Judah. And what we need to understand in this context is that these events created a profound change that's reflected in the laws of Deuteronomy. The text asks, now that all Israelites are responsible for one another, now that we've seen our our co-Israelites taken off to a foreign land, how will we respond? How will we keep the nation, the people intact and alive? How do we deal with the issue of slavery? And so he says, Leviticus seems to be more humane than Deuteronomy, but in fact, it is not. And following that scholar, Jeffrey Teague, Deuteronomy is actually the more humane text, but the main issue is not status, but time. 50 years, which was in Leviticus, to emphasize the obvious, is a very long time. If one became a slave at the beginning of the cycle as an adult, he would be a slave for the rest of his life. 6 years as a hired labor, however, is manageable. 49 years is not. So returning to that other scholar's appeal to Deuteronomy's sense of reality, there was a point during the Babylonian captivity where all the slaves, or just prior to it, were briefly emancipated, apparently to help fight off the enemy. But as soon as the crisis was over, the slaves were enslaved again. The prophet Jeremiah, he points out, deplored these developments. And the incident, though, he says, reflects the reality of slavery in the ancient world, which has kind of been sort of the theme that I've been sharing. And given this reality, given the human propensity to indebtedness, Leviticus, as he says, looks like an impossible dream. Deuteronomy humanizes the covenant code that's in Exodus and works for significant reforms given the realities of its time. Leviticus says there's no such thing as an Israelite slave. Deuteronomy understands that there will be slaves, and they must be treated well until they're released. Combining the laws of the covenant code, again in Exodus, with a dislike or aversion for the enslavement of Israelites in Leviticus, Deuteronomy forged a compromise that was workable for its time. Okay, the idea, again, and this was probably more information that than you wanted, but you see this gradual regulation, and then even kind of laying the groundwork for eventually abolishing it. First, that slavery, for fellow Israelites was not a thing that the law emphasized or thought was a good thing. And so I guess in what we're saying here, slavery is this deplorable condition that's existed throughout human history. It existed in our own country until about a century and a half ago. But you see in the Bible this gradual movement. We'll touch a little bit on the New Testament before we're done on Saturday. You see this gradual movement. I tried to say this in my sermon on Sunday. This gradual movement of recognizing that how wrong it is, and a movement away from enslaving others to allowing everybody to be free. We sometimes think that the Bible automatically changes things, and what it does, I guess one way of putting it is it changes hearts and minds. Again, slavery was not God's doing, but God's word working on God's people over the centuries gradually enabled them and us to see how wrong it was and how it was good, finally, to be abolished, although that work is still not done even in our own time. Well, that was a lot. I'm going to share a little bit more tomorrow and Saturday before we wrap up this topic. So until then, you have a great day. We'll talk to you again tomorrow. Until then, take care. Bye.